Welcome back everybody to land law and the topic of co-ownership. In this video we're going to talk about the tenancy in common. Now this is going to be a particularly short lesson given the fact that there's not that much to say on the issue of the tenancy in common and the joint tenancy in and of itself, as in trying to just describe and explain what they mean and what they do. But more so when we talk about the concept and the relationship between law and equity in relation to co-ownership, we will start to see that there's more detail that can be examined, and we'll get to that in the next lesson. But then other than that, the topic of severance is probably the biggest issue in relation to the co-ownership of property in land law. Now, there are other topics within co-ownership that I might go on to in future lessons time in more advanced studies of this topic, but for the most part, just be aware that we are going to talk about the joint tenancy, we're going to talk about the tenancy in common, we're going to talk about the relationship between law and equity in co-ownership, and then we're going to talk about severance, and that's about it. But there are other things that you can talk about with relation to co-ownership that we might get onto if we ever come back to talking about land law in the future. So in the previous lesson, what we did was spend some time looking at the idea of the joint tenancy in the law of co-ownership, what the joint tenancy meant. And as a basic recap, the joint tenancy refers to a single unity between the co-owners of a property, such that they have the same rights to possession and enjoyment of that property. In order to satisfy the existence of a joint tenancy, there has to be the presence of the four unities: the unity of possession, the unity of interests, the unity of title, and the unity of time. This lesson is going to look at the other method of co-ownership, the idea of the tenancy in common. So when we see a tenancy in common, we can delineate it from the joint tenancy in the sense that it is a situation where there is not necessarily unity as to the ownership of the property, as to the co-ownership of the property. The co-owners of the property are divided, and they represent distinct owners in distinct pieces of the property. They aren't co-owning the property in the sense that they own the property in its entirety and they represent a single unified unit that are of these co-owners. They in fact own different parts of the property potentially, or have different shares in the property, or even have different interests and rights and enjoyment of the property, rather than having a single distinct or a single unified ownership of said property. Since there is a distinction between owners, you would perhaps be interested to know, or at least you would probably come to the conclusion, that there would be a lack of unity as to ownership, at least as a requirement to show a tenancy in common. And you'd be right. There is no requirement for there to be the four unities when we talk about the tenancy in common. So this idea of there being a unity of possession, unity of title, unity of interest, and unity in time is not a requirement for the tenancy in common. The only requirement is that there be one of the unities that exists for the tenancy in common. This is the unity of possession. Each of the co-owners of a tenancy in common still have to have ownership over the property and possession of the property. But other than that, the rest of the topic, the rest of the unities are not necessarily required. This is not to suggest, though, that there may not be the presence of other unities, but it's just that they are not required. The other three are not required for there to be a tenancy in common. In reality, this is what distinguishes a joint tenancy from a tenancy in common. The four unities are required. All four of them are required in order for there to be a joint tenancy. So if you ever have a problem question, and part of the problem question requires you to make a distinction between whether or not the scenario in question is that of a joint tenancy or that of a tenancy in common, you have to, the easiest way of trying to work that out is to see if the scenario in question satisfies the four unities. If not, then there cannot be a joint tenancy. It can only be a tenancy in common. At that point, you would then have to go, well, is there unity of possession? If there's unity of possession, then there's then there's a tenancy in common. If there isn't even a unity of possession, then there isn't even a joint tenancy. There isn't even a co-ownership at that point. So this is really the process by which, or at least the understanding of which, we have for a tenancy in common. I'm going to get into the details of the law and equity relationship that exists in the next lesson, and then start to talk about the process of the conversion from a joint tenancy to a tenancy in common, in addition to the idea of severance, and that's what the next few lessons are going to cover.